CA branch, CA Kirti Joshi ji, other committee members of Indore branch, past chairman Pankaj Shah ji, vice chairman CA Samkit Bhandari ji, and moderator of today's session Deepak Mool Chandani ji, and all seniors of the profession and all other professional colleagues. I, CA Ankush Jain, Secretary Indore CA branch, welcomes you all in this virtual meeting on reviving Indian economy after pandemic. And today, when economics of the world are plugging, the CA community as a partner in nation building should play its role in the revival of the Indian economy. So to guide us for the accomplishment of our role, we have with us very renowned economist of India, Shri Montek Singh sir. So before starting session, I request CA Kirti Joshi ji, Chairman Indore branch, for his opening address. Over to Kirti bhai.
Thank you, Ankush. Respected Montek Singh Ahluwalia ji, former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission of India. Respected Deepak Mulchandani sir. Respected Pankaj Shah ji, past Chairman Indore branch. Abhay Sharma ji, past Chairman Indore branch. CA Samkit Bhandari ji, Vice Chairman Indore branch. Managing Committee members of Indore branch, seniors in the profession, and dear professional colleagues. Good evening. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you all on behalf of Indore branch of CIRC of ICI in this CA Week celebration. The pandemic has exposed fault lines in the global trade and financial architecture, disrupting our travel pattern, global manufacturing, value chains, and governance system. The crisis brings home some potential lessons. Individual health outcome cannot be diverged from the health and hygiene system of the community, that the national border are not defense against threats from the nature, and that collective global action is increasingly a sine qua for our own individual potential from such events. India's economy has been hit hard by the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, though it appears that the economic damage during the second wave has been less than 2020. So for getting the integrities and nitty-gritties and future about the Indian economy after COVID-19, we have amongst us Ahluwalia ji, and I welcome you, sir, on behalf of Indore branch. And Indore branch is going to celebrate its golden jubilee year. To make it memorable, we have come up with 50 initiatives, and now we are also going to organize a 2 days national conference. So I am requesting you all to kindly register yourself for the same. Thank you very much. And without taking much time, over to you, Ankush ji.
Thank you, sir. Now I request past chairman Indore branch, CA Pankaj Shah ji, for his words.
Thank you, Ankush. It is indeed a great pleasure to welcome Montek Singh Ahluwalia ji. I would say the father of Indian economy, what it stands today. I have been chasing sir and troubling him since last 2 years to invite him to Indore branch, and today is a great day. I have been successful in inviting him. One very important and great thing about sir, I would like to inform you all that he was the person who introduced a chartered accountant to the planning policy making of the country. Our respected past president Shri Vayesh Waligam sir. Based on discussion with Montek sir, he is of the sound view that the role of chartered accountants is very important in framing economy. And today he will pave us the light on how we should play our role to develop the economy. Sir, I would like to welcome you on the behalf of Indore branch. Thank you, sir. Over to Ankush.
Thank you, sir. Now for further proceeding of the session, I request C. Deepak Mool Chandani, sir, moderator of today's session, for further proceeding. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ankush. I welcome all of you, and I express deep gratitude in inviting me to moderate this session to the fatherly figure whom I have been looking up to over so many years while learning and developing myself. Montek sir, you have been seeing the trajectory of this Indian economy right from the start, right from the license Raj to the new economic policy, the telecom revolution under Rajiv ji, and then under Manmohan Singh ji, you have seen the liberalization, privatization, and globalization policy shift. And then you have worked and served the country with the tenure as a deputy chairman of Planning Commission under the UPA first and the UPA second regime. Sir, in the current scenario, a lot of copybook methods and a lot of traditional methods have been brought under question because the new realities what pandemic has brought in has emerged. Now we are having a bumpy ride of economics and bumpy ride of the economies of all the world with changing scenarios. And when we incorporate all together a different vision, a different thought process, a different approach and ideologies all coming together. So we would like to have the best output from you from the scarce thing like time, that we would like to seek your pearls of wisdom on various aspects. And when we say this, good economics vis-a-vis good politics is a kind of a dicey issue when we talk about. So I would request you to take us through the overall scenario of the Indian economy as of now, and then some specific sectoral aspects, which I would be highlighting one by one in between, on one by one, which you can take us through. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank all of you, first of all, for inviting me, and secondly, for all the very kind words that you have said about me. You know, I always feel that if you've been a little bit in public life, a lot of things that are said about you are not true. And that's not only true of the bad things, but it's also true of the good things. However, since one gets a lot of bad things, you take the good things into your stride and simply say thank you to whoever is saying them. But I would just say that, you know, I was lucky to be where I was. I certainly regard myself as having been at a critical stage of the Indian economy, and having been in that for a sufficiently long period to be able to have certainly a very good ringside view and also participate in those discussions. And I've written all about it in my book, Backstage. So I think those of you who want to get a sense of what went on and how things changed and so on should take a look at that book. It'll give you a good sense of the change of policy. And I think most of all, it will also tell you that, you know, at any given time, whatever policy is being discussed, because we're in a democracy, is going to be highly controversial. I mean, I firmly believe it is the job of the opposition to criticize. It's not the job of the opposition to praise. But people should realize that it's the job of the opposition to criticize, it's the job of the government to counter that criticism. And a healthy debate of that kind makes people understand what the issues are. That's one point. But also, I think if we have such a healthy debate, then over time, you know, a consensus begins to evolve. And to me, one of the most interesting things about the last 30 years, and I hope it'll be true for the next 10 or 20 also. I mean, I'm at an age where I don't think beyond the next 10, or it's certainly not beyond the next 20, although I have a vested interest in it because I have grandchildren. And the key thing, I think, is that successive governments build on whatever was achieved and they carry it forward. And I think we've been lucky that when the 91 reforms were introduced, they were opposed within the Congress party. I mean, you know, Mr. Narasimha Rao and Mr. Montek Singh really brought about radical reforms. Those reforms were opposed by the right, they were opposed by the left, they were even opposed within the Congress party. So, you know, the fact that things are controversial should not upset one at all. Because if something is important, it's going to shake some vested interest. That doesn't mean, by the way, that everything you do is right. But I think we should expect that there will be some controversy and we should discuss that. And I feel that if those things are discussed, then over time, a kind of consensus develops. And that is really what happened. I mean, the UPA, the first government of Mr. Narasimha Rao was succeeded by a National Front government, which included the communists, but they carried on the reforms. They were succeeded by NDA government under Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and they also carried on the reforms and deepened them. So, you know, if you're a businessman, I think in a democracy, it's an important signal to give that, look, at any given time, we'll all be fighting with each other, and that's democracy. But underneath it all, we're working towards building a consensus and moving the country in the right direction. And unfortunately, I feel that in this world of social media and SMSs and WhatsApps and so forth, I mean, that message is slightly lost, and you get too much negativity, and not enough sitting back and thinking. That's just an introductory comment. Now let's look at today. Where do we stand today? I think it's very important to realize that the pandemic, I mean, there's no question that the pandemic has been a big shock. It's also not a purely Indian phenomenon. It's there across the world. You can ask legitimate questions about whether we could have managed it better than we did. And that's a useful debate to have, particularly because, there could be third shocks, and we need to learn. Somebody in the introduction once said that the second second wave was much stronger than the first, but it didn't actually lead to such a large negative effect. And the main reason for that was that there was no national lockdown. I mean, there were regional lockdowns. If you look at the curve, I mean, the first peak up to September slowly goes up to just under 1 lakh infections, then it comes down. And frankly, by December, January, they've come down quite a bit. But suddenly in February, it starts rising, or rather in March, it starts rising. And by May, the peak is 4 lakh infections. So although it was a much stronger peak, there wasn't a lockdown. There's not a national lockdown. And I think that some of the extreme reaction that we had in terms of negative growth probably was due to the fact that the lockdown was excessive. Although at that time, maybe people didn't realize that that was the case. And we have to recognize that the pandemic is an unusual event. It's a once in a century event. There's no experience to go by. So these things have to be taken into account. Nevertheless, the data show that GDP in 2021 declined by 7.3%. Many people think that this is actually an underestimate of the damage because we don't have data on what happened to the informal sector. And we are usually assuming that the informal sector must have behaved the same as the formal sector. And many economists have said that that's not true. And if you take that, then maybe the negative was not 7.3, it could have been higher. That's not so important. I mean, the critical point is where this discussion is about post-pandemic. So whatever the decline in 7.3 or 8 or something, I have no doubt that in the course of this year, that is in the course of 21-22, we will have a recovery. It won't be the kind of V-shaped recovery that everybody at one stage was talking about. In all probability, what will happen is by the end of this year, we will have got back to where the economy was in 2019-20, which actually means the pandemic will have led to a full 2 years of lost growth, during which period population has increased. So if GDP remains the same, gets back to the same level, and population increase, it means that per capita GDP would be lower. And that obviously means that many people will be pushed below the poverty line. Consumption will be declining. The pandemic has created a lot of uncertainty also. I mean, even if you look at what has happened, the recovery is a very uneven recovery. Some sectors are actually doing quite well. Obviously, pharma, health sector, the IT-based sectors, e-commerce. Many people who earlier were not relying on e-commerce for purchases are now doing so. So from those sectors are actually positively influenced. Manufacturing is struggling back. Because we have a constant reporting almost on a daily basis, you keep hearing little bits of news which tells you, oh yes, there's a recovery. But my feeling is that we will be lucky if manufacturing as a whole in the course of 21-22 reports that we are now back to where we were in 2019-20. In other words, capacity utilization, which is still low, will have got back to where it was. Some sectors have been very badly hurt. Small scale sector and informal sector generally. Also, I think sectors which depend a lot on contact, hospitality, travel, tourism, malls, organized retail, restaurants, hotels. These sectors are well below their normal level even now. And I think we'll only get back to something like normal level maybe next year. So in a sectoral sense, it's an uncertain, it's an uneven recovery. But there are two other factors which are relevant. One is that it's what they call a K-shaped recovery. You know, certain segments of the society actually seem to have done quite well. I mean, if you look at you must all be familiar with the financial results of the listed companies and so on. So you find that, you know, whereas sales may have declined 4 or 5%, profit has gone up by 30%. Now, what has actually happened is that although sales have declined, a lot of labor, which earlier was contractual, has been shed. And that's not a surprising development because, you know, if a firm is suddenly faced with a change that instead of an expected growth rate of 8 or 9%, they're down to -8 and not sure when it will recover, they just shed labor. So when labor is shed, I mean, profits go up, labor income goes down, your value added, which is profits plus labor, goes down, which is why sort of GDP in manufacturing slows down, but the profit component is actually improved. And this has been combined with a very loose monetary policy around the world, and also I think in India, which itself is not a bad thing to do, but which has led to liquidity sloshing around and creating an asset price bubble. So the existing well-known established companies experience an increase in their share value, partly led by the fact that their profits have done quite well, even though the sector has not done quite well. On the other side, of course, there is the informal jobs which have simply disappeared. And, you know, maybe they'll come back in a year or two. People have gone back to rural areas, slightly beginning to come back, but nowhere near the original levels. So you've got a situation where there are groups that are doing extremely well and others that are actually doing worse than they were doing earlier. And you know, the unemployment data is very worrying because what the unemployment data says is that unemployment is especially high amongst the young. I mean, for those in the 18, 19 type of age group, unemployment rates are about 18%. Now, you know, this is painful. And in any system, one advantage is that most of these young people come from families which have some ability to protect themselves against adverse developments. So they don't start starving immediately. And as a result, they can hope that maybe a year from now, things will improve. But you know, if we don't see that improvement, the social consequences of high unemployment amongst the youth can be extremely damaging. I mean, how a political system copes with that is an important issue. And my own sense is that you cannot have a well-functioning society if the youth lose hope in their own immediate future. I don't think we are there now, but this is where it's very relevant. What does the future look like? So let me come to that. See, I think I have no hesitation in saying that, you know, if the GDP declined by 8% last year, it'll probably go up by 8% this year in order to get back to 2019-20. But that is not growth. That is only a return to levels of production. The real question that we have to ask ourselves is, what will be the growth of the economy after we have returned to the pre-pandemic level of production. Now, this is clearly, the government hasn't specified this, and I can understand they're all preoccupied with how to manage the current situation. That's fair enough. But you know, the worrying thing is that the simplest solution would be, simplest projection would be that, you know, when the pandemic is over, we will go back to the growth rate we had before. Now, what was the growth rate we had before? Now, actually, if you take the last year of the BJP government and the full 10 years of the UPA government and the first 3 years of the Modi government, so I'm not trying to make this into a political point, you know, in the sense that this spans 3 different governments. Of course, most of it is UPA. You have a growth rate which is something like averaging about 7.5% or thereabouts. Okay? That's a very strong growth rate. I mean, the UPA growth rate declined in the last 3 years, but it was beginning to pick up. First 3 years of the Modi government, the growth rate did pick up. I mean, at that time, many of you will remember Arun Jaitley ji saying that we are now ready to hit 10% growth, 10% per year. So the government's own expectation was that whereas the growth rate had decelerated in the last 3 years of the UPA, and of course, politically, they blame the UPA for that. That's fine. That we're going to change all that and we are set for now a return to high growth. That was the right thing, in my view, to do. And I think in the first 3 years, we did get that. But you know, after 2016, I mean, this has been said many times, the economy slowed down. And in the year before the pandemic, things were not particularly good. I mean, we had a growth rate, originally it was 4%, since then it's been lowered. So the question we have to ask ourselves is that when we recover, and we will recover, what will we recover to? In other words, what will be the growth rate in the year 2023 and 23 going forward? Now, we have no official projection of that, which is unfortunate because I think we should have. I don't think we can get 8% growth. But, you know, if the government were to say that, look, we are targeting that it will go back to somewhere between 6.5 and 7, that would be one signal. At least it would be saying that, look, it had slowed down to an average of 4.5%. It won't be that. It's going to be better. And I think then one would ask oneself that why do we think it'll be better? And that question is best answered by saying that, look, the reason why it slowed down in the last 3 years before the pandemic is X, Y, and Z. You know, this, in our view, this is what caused the slowdown. And these will not be there in future, or we are countering it, or we are doing the following additional things that will stimulate the economy. And that would provide, in my view, a very reasonable basis for saying what the growth rate is going to be. They haven't done that for whatever reason. My personal view, by the way, is that it's going to be difficult to get back to 7.5%, 8%. It's not realistic to think that we'll quickly get back to that. But I think if we were to say that, look, we are going to take steps now, which will make sure that, let's say, in the year 22, 23, the growth rate will be around 6%, and thereafter it will slowly go up and maybe get to 7, hopefully above 7 in a couple of years. That's a reasonable projection for India, and we should look at the policies needed to achieve that. Obviously, the earlier targets, you know, like the $5 trillion economy target, is just not feasible, in my view. I don't think that's been actually even formally admitted by the government. And I feel it's a good idea to recognize that when the world has changed, when a huge pandemic has occurred, just get rid of that target. I mean, we're not going to get there. Then we ask ourselves, well, how do we avoid just getting stuck at 4.5%? Well, my feeling is that there are 3 or 4 things that we have to do. One relates to managing the recovery in the current year itself. It's interesting that in the previous year, the fiscal deficit was 9.6% or something like that. In the current year, the budget has said it's going to be 6.8%. But many industrialists have said in public that there should be more fiscal stimulus. Now, if you look at the literature on the fiscal deficit, most people would regard a deficit for the central government alone of 6.8% as a very high deficit. And therefore would not say that you should do more than 6.8% unless you can justify it. The problem really is that, and furthermore, they would say, well, look, if your own projections and the current budget projections do say were based on a growth rate of 11.3%. Now, clearly, in the current year, it's not going to be 11.3%. But the government haven't actually said what they think it's going to be. RBI has said it will be about 9.5. Even that, I think, is a bit exaggerated. Most independent analysts put the growth rate as somewhere between 8% and maybe 9% or so. Now, if the budget was formulated on the assumption of 11.3%, and the actual result is actually much lower, maybe 9%, then one thing is clear, that you're not going to get the revenues that you were expecting. And if you factor that in, we should have a projection that, look, the growth rate is going to be lower, and therefore the fiscal deficit is actually going to be higher. Or is it being assumed that we are going to stick to 6.8% fiscal deficit in spite of a loss of revenues, which means that expenditure will come down? Now, the finance minister just a couple of days ago made, I think, a very important announcement that she's giving more expenditures of certain kinds. I think that's the right thing to do. But what she has not said is this going to be accommodated by a larger fiscal deficit, or is it going to be accommodated by other expenditures being held back? I feel that if somebody asked me, I would say that, look, please don't bother about the fiscal deficit in the current year. Take the budget, look at the expenditures that you have specified, and say that, look, we're going to meet these expenditures, and maybe if we need some more, such as the thing that the finance minister has recently announced, we're going to do that also. But the revenues are not going to be what we thought they were. Therefore, the fiscal deficit will be higher, and give an estimate. It won't be 6.8, it'll be much more. In the rest of the world, this is what other countries are doing. Mr. Biden has just come up with a fiscal deficit of 10% of GDP. So I don't believe that anybody would criticize India on the fiscal deficit this year. But what they would say is that, look, this is going to raise your debt to GDP ratio. The fiscal deficit, because it relates to net borrowing, is a measure of how much additional debt you incur. So a high fiscal deficit means that the debt to GDP ratio will be higher. And then there are two reasons why people don't like a high fiscal deficit. The first is the crowding out of the private sector in that year. Because obviously, if you have a high fiscal deficit, the government is absorbing whatever savings there are or whatever the Reserve Bank is putting into the system, and it's being denied to the private sector. Now, in my view, that is not a problem this year, simply because the private sector is not in a position to expand investment. They have lots of other problems, and until those problems are taken care of, except for a very few firms, they will not be in a position to expand their own investment. So it makes sense for the government to invest in building infrastructure a little faster than otherwise. And, as and when the economy recovers, we can ease off this expenditure. I'm in favor of doing this on the expenditure side and not on tax relief. And the reason is, quite frankly, that when you give relief in taxes, it's very difficult to take it back. Whereas if you spend more money in expenditure, it's very easy next year not to spend it, because people don't regard that as having been taken away from them. So I think that an increase in the fiscal deficit this year is not going to be a problem from a crowding out point of view, but it will be a problem from the point of view of debt to GDP ratio going up. Now, frankly, when the debt to GDP ratio goes up, what most people think about is how are you going to bring it down over time? Because if it keeps going up, the interest cost of the debt keeps mounting. You're not able to manage the fiscal situation either without raising more taxes, which has negative effects, or by inflationary financing, which also has negative effects. But what we could do is to say, look, we've had an exceptional 2 years. It's been very bad. We're now undertaking the following programs that will actually bring our deficit down within over the next 3 or 4 years to some more reasonable level. The problem with this approach is that our credibility based on the past is not very good. And I'm not saying this just about this government. That's true even of the UPA. Because, in the UPA, in the early years of the UPA, we promised to bring down the fiscal deficit, and we did. Between 2004 and 2007, there was a sharp reduction in the fiscal deficit, and those were the years when private investment boomed. Once the global financial crisis hit in 2008, the fiscal deficit was expanded. It was then expanded for a second year, which I think was the right thing to do, just as I'm saying now. But what the then finance minister, Mr. Mukherjee, had said is that after that, we're going to bring it down. But we failed to bring it down. And I think one of the reasons he failed to bring it down is that too much of his fiscal expansion was actually due to tax relief, lowering a whole lot of tax rates. And when you lower tax rates, it becomes very difficult to raise them again. So I think in the same sense, people will doubt the government's sincerity because of the past, but we have to take steps that will make clear that we actually do intend to do something. And I think one advantage which this government has is that it is quite willing to say that it wants to monetize public sector. Now, we have to wait and see whether they succeed in doing that. Various disinvestments are being talked about. Simply disinvesting, selling one public sector enterprise to another public sector enterprise is not, in my view, privatization. That's just taking money away from one part of the public sector and kind of giving it to the budget indirectly. But if you actually sold it to private investors, including foreign investors, that's a net gain in resources. So I think we have to see whether they succeed in doing that. In a way, Air India will be a test case because it's so much in the news that if they actually succeed in privatizing Air India, people around the world will believe that, yes, the government of India is willing to monetize public sector assets. The danger, quite frankly, there is that I don't know what's going on internally, but there's always a danger that someone in the system will say that this is a fair price for Air India, and they always exaggerate what is a fair price for a public sector product unit. And if they don't get that price, they'll say that, well, should we sell at a distressed sale or not? And that becomes a government decision, which can become politically difficult. So I don't know. But definitely, if over the next 3 or 4 years, we had a serious policy of getting out of a number of public sector enterprises, I think people would treat that as a seriousness of intent. We have to see whether the government would be willing to do that or not. That's one thing. Second, quite honestly, is taxation. I think if you look at any professional assessment, people will say that, look, India has been developing for the last 15, 20 years. But the ratio of tax to GDP has been stationary. So even though per capita GDP has gone up, the ratio of tax to GDP has remained more or less the same, which means that taxes have only increased at the same rate as GDP. Whereas most people would say that the buoyancy or the elasticity of tax revenue to GDP should be more than 1. In other words, taxes should have increased more than GDP. After all, a lot of people are getting into the tax net, formalization is taking place, and so on and so on. So I think we have to ask ourselves what is happening there. And I think there are a lot of potential things which could be done. To my mind, one of the most important is to fix the problems with the GST. I happen to believe that the GST is a very important reform. During the UPA time, the government pushed for it very strongly. It was then opposed by the BJP, including Gujarat. And that's fine, that's politics. I give credit to the government that having come in, whatever they did earlier, they said, yeah, GDP is a good GST is a good reform, let's do it. And they did it. Because after all, bringing about a constitutional change, etc., is important. But I do feel that the way it has been implemented is actually not likely to generate the benefits that most people thought a GST would generate. And I think this is the conventional view of most experts in the subject. So I think we need to look at GST and see, practically go back to scratch. And how to do this is the task for the government. We have the GST Council, which is the key decision-making body. One of the problems in the GST Council is that they seem to have developed a preference for unanimity. Now, frankly, if 29 states have to be unanimous, what it really means is that each state has a veto. The truth is that you don't need unanimity. You need a majority of the votes, where the central government has, I forget, 25% or something of the voting power, and the rest is distributed among states equally. So the small states get as much as the big states. I think if the government can, I forget whether the government has 25% or 33 and 1/3. We need to check that. But even if some states are not agreeable, I think an effort should be made, first of all, to reach an agreement. What is wrong with the structure? Experts say that we have too many rates, and the rates are very randomly distributed. Many important items are completely excluded from the GST. We should bring them in. Real estate is one of them, petroleum is another, and so on. And I think we have far too many which are at 0 rate, and the 5% rate is actually too low. So we should lower the upper rate, raise the bottom rate, take some of the fellows out from 0, and get a new structure. Now, you can easily imagine no state chief finance minister wants to agree to any increase in rates. In fact, most of them will be pushing for lower rates. And even today, because of this pandemic and the negative effect on GDP, people are pushing for lower rates of GST. I think actually that's wrong. I mean, you don't solve the problem by lowering rates of taxation. If you want to give a stimulus, it's much better to give a stimulus by increasing expenditure and infrastructure. We should get a consensus on what the tax reform should be, and have a GST meeting and generate public pressure to bring it about. Now, that could be a major statement of policy. I have said that if you go back to 1991, somebody mentioned Maligram being brought in. One of the interesting things that we did was that we set up an external expert group on tax policy reform. And I think Maligram was one of the Chelaya committee. And Maligram was part of that committee. You need tax reform to be looked at not by members of the revenue department, but by a combination of economists, fiscal experts, chartered accountants, business guys, management guys, and so on, including people who advise foreign companies, because the tax treatment of foreign companies is another important element in the whole process. So personally, I feel that it would be good if the government were to set up a similar distinguished panel of outstanding people and tell them within 4 months to come up with a series of proposed reforms on taxation, which could lead ultimately to a lot of reforms, not just in the tax rate, but also in the method of tax administration. A lot of our problems are really related to how the tax system is administered, and not necessarily the tax rates, and also to extreme vagueness and ambiguity, which actually allows tax officers to interpret the law in whatever different way they are inclined to. Part of the problem here, by the way, is that we're not totally frank on what the revenue is going to be. I mean, look at the current situation. We have a budget where there were certain revenue estimates made based on a growth rate of GDP of 11.3%. Now we know that it's not going to be 11.3%, it's going to be much lower. I think it may be around 8%. RBI has put it at 9.5. Maybe it'll become 8.5. Now, I'm not aware whether, I don't see why the government doesn't accept this fact and say that, look, we had hoped that the growth would be higher, but it's not going to be higher. That's why we're doing the fiscal stimulus. As a result, the growth will be lower than we projected, therefore revenue targets will be less. And if you do that, then every tax officer will have a reduced revenue target to meet. If you don't do that, and he is supposed to keep meeting the original revenue target, he will simply make tax assessments which businessmen will find are completely absurd. Because business is down and tax fellows are expecting much higher tax revenues. How do you justify that? So I think these are some of the reasons why ease of doing business in India tends to be low. And I think it's about time that we recognize that. I think the other big area where we do have major problems is in banking and financial sector reform. I won't go into that. You know that what the position is regarding stressed assets and so on. One of the really good things that was done in the last 2 or 3 years by the present government is the legislation of the IBC, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Now that got interrupted because of the pandemic, and also as it started to operate, the companies against whom it was being brought in started lobbying to prevent the IBC from becoming effective. Now, I think holding it back for a year because of the pandemic was perhaps reasonable. But now that the recovery has begun, we need to give a clear signal. Are we serious about the IBC or not? And if we are serious about the IBC, that will send a signal that will let every businessman know, particularly the large ones, that you can't just renege on loans with no cost whatsoever. And I think what the government does in terms of signaling there is actually extremely important. One other thing, and I don't want to take too much time because I think you probably want some period for questions. I think that one of the issues that has come up, which was raised earlier also, is what can we do to have a healthy growth of manufacturing? There's a lot of nervousness in the world about China. I won't go into the reasons for that, they're pretty obvious. But geopolitically, the major advanced countries who are still the most important world trading companies want to restructure their supply chain away from China to the extent possible. I don't think they're going to stop dealing with China. China is too important, too big for that. But people would want to have a little more diversification and not kind of complete dependence on China. India is not in a position where we can hope to replace China in anybody's thinking of economic scale, but we could look like a credible source of diversification. So some of the business that moves away from China goes to India. And I think we should be very clear about what we need to do that. But I feel that the present policy is a little confused on that. in the last 3 years, for example, we've been raising customs duties, responding to demands by Indian industry for protection. This is a very big subject, so I won't elaborate on it because it may be that you all know what the issues are. We can go into them in question and answer sessions. But you know, the fundamental thing we learned from 1991 is that when you try to reduce duties, businesses always scream. But if they know that duties are coming down and you are doing other things that will help improve competitiveness, they will organize themselves to become more competitive. I mean, right now, for example, Bajaj and Mahindra and TVS scooters, these companies are doing well in exports, in spite of some reduction that took place in duty. So their competitiveness has been very good globally. But if we start raising duties, that will only erode their competitiveness. And I think that the raising of duties is a mistake. Many people think that it's a logical consequence of the Atmanirbhar decision. Although, frankly, if you look at what the government says, the government doesn't say Atmanirbhar means raising duties. In fact, Atmanirbhar means everything. Even the effort to revive the economy is described as part of Atmanirbhar. So as a slogan, I have no problem with Atmanirbhar being sort of a way of saying, look, we must strengthen the economy. But you need a debate on what will strengthen the economy as opposed to weaken it. And my view is that the raising of duties will actually weaken the economy. I think it's also unfortunate that we did not join the RCEP agreement. You know, the Prime Minister himself had put forth this slogan, which was actually quite attractive, that instead of merely looking east, which is what Narasimha Rao had said, we should act east. And the fact is that Asia is the fastest growing region in the world. It's the most open region. It is the region where trade is expanding and countries are integrating. Yes, China is a very important part of the region. Yes, we have nervousness about China. But the idea that we are not going to be in RCEP because China is there, to my mind, is a mistake. You know, we must remember that if all these other countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, they can all be part of RCEP and compete with China, there's no reason why we can't. And the RCEP duty reductions were phased over a very long period, during which time we could have fixed the problems that the industry has with many aspects of our policy, which cause them to be uncompetitive, like poor infrastructure, etc., etc. So we should be building on that rather than simply succumbing to the demand to raise duties. So I think here's another issue that we definitely need to have a much better performance on manufacturing. Everybody agrees with this. Even in the 12th plan, we had a national manufacturing program which said share of manufacturing should go up in value added to 25%. Present government, Make in India, same thing. The question is, what is needed to bring that about? And I think to some extent, we are sending mixed signals in that dimension. Well, let me stop at this point. I mean, I think there are lots of issues on which a clearer declaration of intent is needed, which can then be pursued. You know, I feel that we should not just have long lists of reforms. I mean, it's very easy to make a list of 100 reforms. If you go to each ministry, they always have something or the other that they're doing, and they can string a list together. The important thing is, what are the 5 or 6 things on which we should now concentrate, given where we are, and what's the best way of moving forward? I personally think that fixing the banking system, fixing the IBC, having a more sensible global integration policy, and doing a lot more on infrastructure, both through the public sector and through public-private partnership. Somebody mentioned earlier that I was in favor of public-private partnership, but that now there are also problems. Yes, there are problems because, you know, whenever you do something new, new sets of problems arise. And I think the biggest problem, frankly, with public-private partnership is we don't have a reasonable basis of dispute resolution. I mean, a public-private partnership means that you agree with the private sector that they will be given the right to invest over the next 30 years according to certain rules. Something happens, the world changes, you have to modify the rules, etc. I mean, nobody can actually write a contract which is completely immune to change for 30 years. And I think what the private sector tell me is that, while we call it public-private partnership, government, and this is not the present government, this is true of the UPA also, governments don't view it as partnership. They actually, once you've signed the contract, the government doesn't view the private sector as a partner. The government views the private sector pretty much the way a tax authority views a tax-paying citizen. That you suspect whatever the intention is, and you don't actually want to do anything that will look like giving them an unfair advantage. Now, how do we resolve this issue? It's something we have to think about. I don't believe, by the way, that all the infrastructure that we need can possibly be built through the public sector. I mean, if you go into the national investment pipeline and so on, infrastructure pipeline, there are hundreds of thousands of crores being talked about. But a lot of that is supposed to be through public-private partnership. So whatever the problems with public-private partnership, I think we have to address those problems and try and resolve them. Anyway, with those words, and in all of this, by the way, I think I should say a word about chartered accountants, because if you're looking at the strength of a company from the point of view of the capital market, from the point of view of mergers and acquisitions, from the point of view of debt resolution, whatever it is, high quality accountancy is absolutely critical for the functioning of a modern economy. So you gentlemen are at the cutting edge of critical part of the economy, and I have no doubt that the demand for good quality accountancy services will increase. And I think that the pressure of formalization, which is very strong now with digitalization and so on, will make many companies that earlier didn't use chartered accountants also turn to them to get everything in order. And partly because if their financial transactions become very transparent, they will need high quality chartered accountants to keep everything on track. So with those words, let me thank you for inviting me and listening to me for such a long period, and ask for comments, questions if you have.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much for bringing in those insights, which actually are time in terms of an overall view, which we lack. Sir, I wanted to have your word on specifically the hot topic, which is touching everybody right now. That is cryptocurrencies. The digital currency, which is gaining traction across the globe and which is trying to shift the overall power from the central banks and the governments into uncontrolled hands. And China has come up with its own digital currency now, and all of them are working. What do you foresee in terms of that digital currency impact on the economy and the overall global scenario?
I think you yourself used you used two different terminologies. One was digital currency, and the other is cryptocurrency.
Right.
I think we need to make a distinction between the two. Globally, there is a trend towards digital currency. In other words, and a digital currency is simply like the central bank, and I believe the Reserve Bank is also examining whether it should have a digital currency. It's simply rupees that are digital and not physical. So when you have a rupee that is physical, you have to somehow collect that money from somewhere, give that money physically to the bank, or at some point it has to be physical, and then it can be transferred digitally from one account to the other, with the banks being intermediaries. Okay. Now, digital currency amounts to saying that, look, the Reserve Bank itself will maintain individual accounts. So just as today, the Reserve Bank is is the source of all currency. Uh, Individuals could get the currency from the Reserve Bank by giving currency to it and taking or giving dollars to it. The Reserve Bank would have an individual account. This would be a big change because up to now, the Reserve Bank has always only had accounts with other banks. So individuals deal with banks and the banks deal with the Reserve Bank. What a digital currency means is that, look, you can have an account with the Reserve Bank of India in which you have X amount of money. And if you want, you can transfer that money to your bank account in a bank. But if you don't want to do that, you can transfer it to somebody else's bank account in the Reserve Bank, disintermediating the commercial bank completely. Now, this is not necessarily, if you like, anonymous, because the Reserve Bank will know who's transferred money to whom. A cryptocurrency does not involve any Reserve Bank. It's just something outside some ledger, distributed ledger, using these new blockchain technologies, and there's a currency. The problem with a cryptocurrency is that a cryptocurrency has to have a rate of exchange with some normal currency to be of any value. So you read these things that Bitcoin has suddenly got up to so many $1,000s, then it's collapsed and whatever. I am not a great fan of cryptocurrencies, but I can see the merit of a digital currency, because a digital currency would essentially, I mean, basically eliminate a lot of paper currencies, because everything would then be in accounts maintained by the Reserve Bank, except that individuals could also have those accounts, and then individuals could transfer them to the account of a commercial bank, and then the commercial bank would operate as normal. Now, there is a concern on the part of commercial banks that this will lead to disintermediation. I mean, in the sense that if the commercial banks are not very efficient in transferring money from one account to another account, then people might prefer to just transfer within the Reserve Bank from one account to another account, and there'll be disintermediation from the commercial banking system. I'm not a great fan of cryptocurrency, which has no inherent value of its own. And its only basis for existing as an asset is that its quantity is controlled, and it is worth whatever somebody is willing to pay for it. Now, in a way, the only real reason why that kind of currency has value is when people want anonymity, which usually means some kind of illegal activity. They don't want anyone to know. And they deal in a currency that can be transacted easily across accounts, and also can be transacted across borders. So, for example, it may not be very easy for an Indian to, let us say, invest in holding US dollars beyond whatever is the permitted amount, because that has to go through the banking system. But if you want to invest in Bitcoin and it's all done on the internet and you trust it, well, then there's no government control of that. I'm not sure that there's much economic gain in the expansion of cryptocurrencies. But digital currencies, yes, they will very likely become a competing method of making payments. Now, mind you, the extent to which they will succeed is very much a function of how efficient the banking system is. And you know, in India, this IMPS, etc., it does allow pretty seamless movement from one account to another. So I don't see why a digital currency would be better. Remember that achieving the same objective through the Reserve Bank by transferring from one account in the Reserve Bank to another account in the Reserve Bank, I mean, the only thing is that your banking system will be taken out of it, but it will not give you anonymity, because the government, i.e. the Reserve Bank, will know what is going on.
It is gaining, sir, the cryptocurrency market and the pitfalls which you highlighted is actually gaining a lot of traction, and the parallel kind of an economy is now developing there. Actually, that is a big threat which I may see developing and galloping in terms of going way forward with the kind
Yes,
of
no,
disintegrated thoughts.
that's true. I mean, it is, you have to ask yourself why. I mean, look, a Bitcoin inherently has no value whatsoever. And you have to ask yourself, what is the value? What is the value of transacting in an asset whose price keeps shooting up and down with no relation to any economic factor whatsoever?
Hmm.
Under what circumstance? I mean, one reason for doing it is just pure speculation. That is, you like to outguess the market and make some money. But I don't think that is something that introduces any economic benefits to the system. Uh, so
Correct.
my own guess is that, and since many countries don't allow cryptocurrency, but they're all trying to go for digital currency. I think where banks are inefficient and where transferring money from a person to another person or another account through the banking system has difficulties, uh, the digital currency will solve that problem. It will not involve any of the exchange rate changes that are involved in Bitcoins. I mean, a digital rupee will be a digital rupee. And what it will mean is that, look, anytime you want, you can go to the Reserve Bank of India and they'll give you printed money. But if you don't want that, you can just have an account in the Reserve Bank of India. But you will always have so many rupees. Now, what the worth of that thing in dollars is going to depend on the exchange rate of the rupee. And that is something that there's a lot of focus on. We know how that works. The government tries to moderate fluctuation, etc. If you invest in bitcoins, I mean, how many dollars is 1,000 bitcoins worth? God only knows. And nobody even knows what determines it. Personally, as an investor, I mean, I think it's just like betting in the races. I don't think it's an economic bet at all.
Sir, in terms of one more thing, I wanted to get your insight on. In terms of the startup scenario which is being developing in the country over the last few years, and the fundings and the kind of capabilities which our young entrepreneurs are showing up, what do you think that in terms of their capabilities can be done further? Means the government has been doing on skill development, but if you ask me truly, when it goes down to the final last mile connection and the output doesn't comes in. It's not about this present regime or the earlier regime. Whenever the skill development efforts or the other efforts come in, but they don't come and finally show up into their actual working capabilities. Have you seen something which is lacking in the overall system, or where we are lacking, irrespective of the UPA or the NDA? Means as a countryman, what do you think? What is going on?
You're referring to the skill development efforts?
Yes, yes,
Oh,
yes.
see, let me say, startups and skill development are two totally different things. I mean,
Okay.
I share your view that even in the UPA, and I suspect it's not very different now, it's not very clear to me that the so-called skill development efforts that governments make are all that successful. I mean, it was our view, there's no question that we need a lot more skill development. And I mean, by any standard, the amount of skill development that we are providing our younger people is very, very low. And in fact, as we move to, and traditionally, Indian workers have evolved their skills mainly by learning on the job. Now, you can become quite good by learning on the job, but you could do it a lot faster if you went through the relevant skill development courses. And I think we need to do more. In my view, governments are very bad as a source of skill development, but there are a lot of private companies that organize targeted skill development. If you wanted to set up, let's say, a hotel chain, and you suddenly need to recruit 5,000 hotel maids, for example. There are companies, I mean, I know some, and I won't mention their names because that will be like advertising. There are companies that you can approach and say, listen, we're setting up a hotel chain, and we want 5,000 maids working in these areas, these cities, who are trained as hotel maids. They'll organize the training for you. Those maids are getting very, very specific training, how to make a bed, how to wish guests in a hotel, things like that. It's not a broad based training of everything. So I think we need a lot more of private involvement in that. In the UPA, we had organized something called the Skill Development Mission, which I think still exists, which tries to bring in the private sector to define the nature of the courses. But you know, the actual organization of the thing is still through ITIs. And the impression I get is that the quality of training given in ITI is not very good. Now, that's something I don't have a solution for, but it's just like with schools, we're not doing a particularly good job in giving our children a good school education. We've expanded the schools, but the quality of education is not good. I think these are long-term things where there are a lot of experts who know better. Startups is a totally different thing. I mean, a startup looks at a person who actually has acquired skills and doesn't want to be an employee and wants to test himself out as an entrepreneur. Now, this is, I think, a very important area for work. India is late getting into it, but we're not doing so badly. I mean, in the sense that, you know, we have a large number of startups, mainly, I think, in the southern states. But I think in any of our major cities, it should be possible to have good startups. And you know, as business improves and business conditions evolve, there'll be many things that young people can think of which will enable them to start a business without having too much bricks and mortar and all, particularly in the IT area, skill development, remote provision of skills, etc., etc., etc. So I think we've even developed some unicorns, whatever billion-dollar companies out of startups. Not very many, but we have some. But you know, a small country like Israel has done extremely well in startups. I chaired a committee for the Punjab government making some recommendations on post-COVID long-term strategy, and we strongly advise them that they should focus on how to give a boost to startups. A lot of what needs to be done is using the existing engineering schools, etc., to create a pro-entrepreneurship culture and creating mentorship so that people with ideas can talk to other people and get mentored, plus creating access to finance. And incidentally, on the finance side, that's really where chartered accountants do come in a big way, because the way the startup system works is that initially people are simply looking to see whether you have an idea and you've actually been able to develop it and to bring it up to concept. But once you're starting to spell it out and expand it, it becomes an economic issue. And one of the biggest problems in India is that if you're a remote investor, you don't have much confidence in the quality of the financial statistics that the startup guys are providing you. And that is where high quality accountancy, which would enable a remote investor to judge whether a company is doing well, becomes quite important.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir, on that. And one small thing which I wanted to understand means 1995, when we became a member of the World Trade Organization, in terms of taking certain stands at the global platforms for India, there are many times where we have taken up a softer stand as compared to the other countries, but despite of having an equal vote at that. And those were the days when we were actually opening up the doors to all the companies around. But don't you think that at one point of time, that advantage was given away to other countries, and the other countries came up very fondly and set up shops in India, and we couldn't do the same to the other countries? Like, despite we having a window of few years before opening up all the things with quantitative restrictions in 2001 and 2002, when 1429 items were allowed for import, the government didn't come back to the producers saying that, hello, this is going to come and this has to be done. I think at that point of time of easing of quantitative restrictions created a bit point of a mismatch, and we were more of a users now of imported products rather than making it on our own. What are the views on this? This was one question which I wanted to ask actually.
No, that's a totally fair question in the sense that, you have to ask yourself that I was very much in the government at different levels at that time, and I was totally in favor of getting rid of quantitative restrictions. Remember, our quantitative restrictions were ridiculous in the sense that consumer goods were simply not allowed to be imported. They were just banned. And the only way you could bring in a consumer good is if you were a passenger and you brought it in as baggage. Otherwise, it could not be imported. Now, one of the things that the WTO said is that, look, you cannot use a quantitative restriction in order to achieve a protective objective. If you want protection, levy a duty, but don't say ban. And my view was, yes, that's correct. I mean, let us levy a duty, and if necessary, then lower the duty over time. Remember, a ban means an infinite duty. It's like, you don't allow, let's say you don't allow chocolates to be imported. Okay. Now, what does that do? Quite apart from the fact that it means that Indians who want to enjoy good quality chocolates don't actually get good quality chocolates. What it also means is that Indian producers of chocolates have absolutely no incentive to produce better chocolates. Today, chocolates are allowed. You can go into the market and buy a Lindt chocolate for 1,000 rupees a bar, or you can buy an Amul chocolate for 340 rupees to the bar. Now, I think and by the way, I discussed this with the Amul people several times, and I said, look, you're producing good chocolates, but you're not putting nuts in them and things like that. Why don't you diversify your product, upgrade your product? Now, over time, what has happened is that the quality of Indian products in these areas has really improved enormously by allowing, for example, cheese to be imported at a high price with a high duty. Indian cheese products in quality have improved. Similarly, the fact that wine is imported but at high duties, Indian wines have improved. So I think the notion that you should ban imports is totally wrong. I don't think that we underestimate what exposure to foreign products does to our own product. Now, I think there's an exaggeration in being swamped with foreign toys. What is really happening is in the world as a whole, for electronic toys, the Chinese have become the dominant supplier. And that's also true for India. We should be asking ourselves, why are we not producing good quality toys? We can always import a duty on toys. We could have 20%, 30%, something like that. For many years, we reserved many of these sectors for small scale. That is, you couldn't produce them with an investment of more than 5. This was the stupidest decision ever, because most of the things we reserved were things of high export value. And people would come to India and say, look, you've got a lot of skills there, but you just don't have companies that can meet the orders we need. Because if you're a department store in a chain of department stores in the US and you want to sell a certain product, you need somebody who's capable of providing, I don't know, 1 million of those products or several 100,000. Whereas most of our fellows were not able to produce more than a few thousand. I think our own policies were actually wrong. And I don't think we should blame this, by the way, on WTO. Because the WTO only said, please don't have quantitative restrictions. If you want to have a protection, please levy a duty. And the big advantage of that is that the duty is a transparent mechanism. I mean, in the sense that if it's chocolate, and if the chocolate manufacturers want a duty of 400%, whereas the jam manufacturers say, no, 30% is good enough for me. A signal would go, okay, boss, if 30% is good enough for them, why do you want 500% or 400%? Actually, you don't need it. You need much less. So I think the only way you can be a credible manufacturer is if your consumers have a choice. If your consumers don't have a choice, then your producers deserve no credit whatsoever because they're not actually competing with anybody. So this notion that we somehow shouldn't be competing is, I think, mistaken.
No, my question was taken a bit differently. What I was thinking and trying to convey is a good amount of ground level preparation could have been done for the Indian companies and tell them that you are going to compete after some time. But the moment the floodgates opened up, they were not prepared at that point of time.
No, that's a totally valid. I mean, I completely agree that as much time as necessary, as much advanced signaling that can be given, should be given, because then it gives the manufacturer a clear
the
signal.
time to adjust.
I have to do this, and you must provide them also with support, finance, all those kinds of. I agree with.
Which was
There's no disagreement with that. And let me say that I also think that I agree with you that was a weakness, and I think the weakness is the result of. I mentioned in my book Backstage that I was in favor of what I would call real gradualism, because gradualism means that, look, we're going to go from here to there, but we're going to go in a series of steps. So let us tell you in advance what these steps are. Then you will know and you will make preparations. Unfortunately, because of political compulsions, the end result and the pace was never spelt out. So we would say, oh, we must open up, but we didn't say when or how much or at what rate. And when it looked politically possible, they would do it. So in my book, I've said this is not gradualism. This is not gradualism. This is actually opportunism. That whenever we can do it, we do it. And sometimes it was also called reform by stealth. That is, somehow you get a chance, you do it. I don't think that's the right way of doing things. I mean, we should actually make it. Look, this is a very relevant thing today. We, in my view, rightly, have taken on a very bold target for increasing our solar generation capacity. That means generation of electricity. To move into solar generation and integrate solar generation into another system is a huge challenge, managerially, technically, etc., etc. The moment we do this, the manufacturers of solar equipment say that, look, you must also give us an opportunity to produce this, which is correct. But the Chinese are highly competitive, so they lobby for duties. Now, what is happening is that we have levied high duties on solar panels. All that this is going to do is going to make solar electricity more expensive. So if the objective is to move away from carbon to solar because we have so much sunshine and so on, that objective is compromise. It would be much better, in my view, to give these fellows a subsidy. That, look, we really want to support you, but we won't put a duty, but we give you a subsidy rather than slapping on duties. I think or if you're going to have a duty, we should say, okay, we're giving you a duty benefit now, but this is going to be reduced in the next 5 years. It's going to come down. Now, this is a very important thing from a signaling point of view, because technology change in the solar electricity generation is taking place very rapidly, in the sense that the efficiency of solar generation panels is expected to improve enormously. Okay. Now, if you get locked into a particular capacity which is based on a low level of technology, and then the international efficiency improves, are you going to keep raising duties? Or are you going to tell the Indian manufacturer that, look, you better be in line with what's happening in the rest of the world? If cost of generating electricity is going to fall by 50% in the next 10 years, you better organize it so that it also falls by 50%. You may have an advantage today, but to live within that advantage, the base has to keep going down. I think we need to do that. Unfortunately, we don't, and again, this is not a problem with the present government. We do not really have adequate exchange with industry on how to plan for major transitions. Let me give you another example. One of the most important ways of getting out of carbonization is moving to electric vehicles. Okay. Now, we have said we're going to move into electric vehicles. But, frankly, at the moment, only about 3% of the scooters sold today are actually electric. 97% are not. And in the rest of the world, people are saying that by 2030, they want all the cars and the vehicles sold to be electric. Now, if that is really the intention, we should say that now. That look, every year for the next 10 years, the duty on internal combustion vehicles is going to increase, and the duty on electric vehicles is not going to increase. Now, if there are two manufacturers in India, one of whom reads the signals right and accelerates his EV push, and the other one doesn't, the other one won't have a case for high duties if somebody else is succeeding. But if you don't tell them, neither of them will do anything. And sure enough, 5 years from now, they'll say, we have so much employment, it's going to be killed. How can you do EV, etc., etc., etc. We need much. I mean, actually, this is the real planning that we need. And we're not doing enough of it.
Great. So that means there are certain things which the country needs to improve. We were thinking on those lines at discussion. These things have to be done. Great, sir. It's really nice to have these insights with you. And I really love economics. I could have more conversations with you, and I would love to get in touch with you to get some learning and insights. But time is a constraint with all of us. So I really thank you to invest your time and give us the wisdom which you have acquired and served the nation till now. And I thank on behalf of the Indore branch, and it's over to Ankush ji to put up a vote of thanks. Ankush ji.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Montek sir, for giving your precious time for Indore branch. And thank you so much, Deepak sir, for always standing with the Indore branch.